which is a municipality located in the northeastern side of Bohol. Specifically, I'm going to talk about 4 small islands: Bilangbilangan, Pangapasan, Ubay and Batasan. As you recall, in October 2013, there was a 7.2 magnitude earthquake in Bohol, which induced land subsidence in these islands. As a result, these islands now become flooded even during normal high tides, which they rarely experienced before the earthquake. Of course, this morning we are talking about climate-induced sea level rise, but what our research team did was to build an analogy using earthquake-induced land subsidence to better understand specifically the flooding impacts of climate-induced sea level rise, for which we currently lack case studies. So using this analogy, we try to address the question, what are the social impacts of relative sea level rise? And from this point, I'm going to play a 1-minute clip that we took on a flooding day in these islands. The small islands of Tubigon are very low-lying, with maximum elevation above water of only a little more than 2 meters. The communities are also impoverished, with many households living below the poverty line. The local highest high tide in the area is only 2 meters. However, in Pangapasan and Bilangbilangan, once the tide level reaches up to 1.8 meters, then the islands start to become flooded, either partially or completely, depending on the local weather conditions. In 2016 alone, we counted a total number of 44 flooded days, with each event lasting up to 2.6 hours. During the king tide in June 2016, we measured a median flood height of about 20 centimeters. The situation is even more dire in Ubay and Batasan, wherein we counted a total number of 135 flooded days in 2016 and measured a median flood height of about 40 centimeters during the king tide in June. In terms of timing, tidal flooding typically occurs during spring tide across several days around the new and full moon of each month. The monsoons also affect the timing of flooding. During Habagat, flooding happens in the daytime, directly affecting school children, and during flooding happens in the nighttime, posing disaster risk to the communities as this coincides with the local typhoon season. As you have seen from the 1-minute clip, the island communities were severely affected by tidal flooding, but at the same time, life goes on in these islands. So now the question is, what are they doing about it? And how are island communities adapting to relative sea level rise? There are many adaptation strategies being implemented in Tubigon, Bohol, which can be classified into 2, retreat and in situ. For the retreat strategies, of course, there was the option of permanent relocation to the mainland. However, there were several challenges to implementing this, such as the lack of funds, and at the same time, the reluctance of the communities themselves to move away from the island, given that their livelihood is mainly based on fishing. Interestingly, what they did instead was to modify their evacuation behavior. So before the earthquake, they rarely evacuated, thinking that only strong typhoons are destructive. But then after the earthquake, when they started to experience tidal flooding, they now readily evacuate to the mainland, thinking that a weak typhoon can also be destructive especially when it happens during high tide. And this modified evacuation behavior has been very effective so far in protecting the lives of the islanders. In terms of in situ strategies, there are also several types. The first being community-based adaptation, which are strategies that are led by the communities themselves and sometimes supported by government and non-government agencies. There's also ecosystem-based adaptation, which for the case of the island communities are in the form of coral reefs as well as mangroves. Finally, there's coastal engineering, particularly seawalls, although when they are poorly designed, they could accelerate coastal erosion. Whenever island communities talk about adaptation, they often get asked, how long can you keep doing what you're doing now? What is the limit of adaptation? This is how many people typically understand adaptation. They think that after a certain tipping point, let's say 1 or 2 meters of sea level rise, then island communities will no longer have a choice but to retreat to the mainland. However, there are several challenges to this current understanding. First, the tipping point is usually expressed as an environmental factor, although we already know for a fact that people move away from their homes for many reasons, including social and economic. And at the same time, in this framing, retreat is often portrayed as a failure of in situ adaptation. There are many other potential limiting factors that are being hypothesized in existing literature to drive mass migration. These include the physical survival of the islands, tidal flood height and frequency, the cost of adaptation, and even extreme events. However, in the experience of the islands of Tubigon, these potential limiting factors determine the level of adaptation and not the limit itself. Instead, there are 2 potential limiting factors that may apply in the experience of the islands of Tubigon, and these are development problems and the future outlook of communities. In Tubigon, although the island communities already experience severe tidal flooding, they are still more concerned about poverty and the lack of livelihood options in the islands. And this can be problematic because development directly relates to adaptive capacity. And at the same time, how the islanders perceive their future on the islands could affect their decision to stay or to leave. But this is not so much about scaring the island communities until finally they decide to move. It's more about painting a more positive outlook for them on the mainland, which the municipal government is currently doing through providing scholarships to students until college, and at the same time ensuring that young islanders have skills that are employable in the mainland. So what are the key takeaways for us? First, we should stop thinking of adaptation as a matter of tipping points, but rather as a matter of choice. Island communities should be able to choose whether they want to adapt via in situ strategies or retreat strategies, or a combination of both. But to be able to make this choice, they should have at least 3 of these things. First, sustainable development, which will help them build their adaptive capacity. They should also have full knowledge of their available adaptation options. And lastly, a proper understanding of the risks that they face in staying as well as in leaving the islands. We should also take control of the narrative and shift away from sinking islands to resilient islands. We should stop thinking of island communities as a basket case and force them to relocate when they aren't ready yet, and rather start to recognize how resilience has always been part of the island life. Thank you.